Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
I'm Michael, 28, and I've spent most of my life quietly watching my family from the sidelines, trying to keep the peace while they bulldozed over my feelings like I was some kind of afterthought. Our family BBQs have always been a minefield disguised as casual summer fun, and this one started no differently. At least, that's what I thought at first. My parents had decided this year to host it at their house, which meant the same cramped backyard, the same wobbly lawn chairs, the same haphazard grill that Dad swore just needed a little love every year. I arrived early, hoping to help set things up, but even before I could unload the cooler from my car, my younger brother, Alex, made sure to remind me that my place in the family pecking order hadn't changed. "This spot's reserved for my friends only," he snorted, pointing at a rickety lawn chair next to the grill. He had that smirk that always made me feel like I was a character in someone else's story. Everyone laughed, Mom, Dad, even a few cousins who were clearly used to his antics. I had learned long ago that arguing with him was pointless. He thrived on attention, and the louder I protested, the more amused everyone else seemed to get. So I just smiled, nodded, and quietly picked another chair a few feet away, careful not to draw too much attention. Inside, though, I felt a familiar tight knot in my chest, that mix of frustration and helplessness I'd learned to ignore. The smell of charcoal, sizzling burgers, and sweet corn filled the backyard, and for a few minutes, I tried to lose myself in the small comforts of summer. The sunlight bouncing off the leaves, the faint hum of the neighbors' sprinklers, the soft laughter of the younger cousins chasing each other around the yard. But Alex had planted a seed, and it was growing fast. Every time I tried to enjoy a conversation or help with something, he found a way to insert himself in the center, always louder, always funnier, always the one everyone watched. It wasn't even subtle anymore. At 28, I thought I might have grown out of caring what he thought, but sitting there, feeling invisible in the chaos of my own family, I realized how deep the resentment ran. I started thinking back to other moments like this. My birthday dinners, holidays, family vacations, they all had a recurring theme. Alex getting the spotlight, while I silently endured the sidelines. My parents meant well, I suppose, but they never seemed to notice the little ways he shoved me out of the picture, and over the years, I'd learned to just tuck my feelings away, smile, and pretend it didn't hurt. This time, however, there was something different. Maybe it was the way Alex's friends had come along this year, smirking with him, whispering as they pointed at me. Maybe it was just me, tired of swallowing every indignity for the sake of keeping the peace. Whatever it was, a spark had ignited, quiet at first, but insistent. Lunch was served on the picnic table, a haphazard spread of burgers, hot dogs, potato salad, and those little grilled corn cobs that Dad insisted we all love even though they were usually charred to the point of blackness. Alex, of course, claimed the seat with the best view, strategically placed between Mom and Dad, ensuring he could monopolize the conversation. I stayed where I was, unmoving, silently observing. He regaled the table with a story about a project he'd led at work, exaggerating every detail. And of course, every laugh that followed was at my expense, or so it felt. Cousins chimed in with their own echoes of admiration for Alex, and I sat there, clenching my jaw, trying not to let my frustration show. I wanted to speak up, to tell everyone I was done being the background character in my own life, but the words caught in my throat. When dessert came out, homemade brownies and that ridiculous store-bought ice cream Mom insisted was the best, Alex had another brilliant idea. "Hey, I saved this chair for my friends, remember?" he said again, glancing at me as if I was expected to respond with laughter or shame. The table chuckled. I just sipped my lemonade, keeping my face neutral. Inside, I was calculating, thinking about the years of silent indignities, the quiet sacrifices I'd made, the constant reminder that in the eyes of my family, I wasn't worth the center of attention. That feeling, that simmering, tight, unfair weight, was familiar, but this time, it wasn't going to be quiet. The tension didn't explode right away. It was more of a slow burn, the kind that eats at you when you least expect it. After the food was cleared and the backyard started to feel sticky with the summer heat, Dad decided it was time for drinks by the grill. Alex, naturally, claimed the best spot again, the chair that wobbled precariously but somehow symbolized his kingdom. He leaned back, arms crossed, chest out, and made a small, dismissive noise when I reached for a chair nearby. "Make sure it's stable," he said, barely glancing at me, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Don't want you falling over." Everyone laughed. I felt my stomach twist. I wanted to respond, to let him know that I wasn't fragile, that I wasn't invisible, but I held my tongue. I had spent too long letting moments like this slip by, but there was a new clarity in my mind. Instead of reacting with anger or embarrassment, I could let the situation unfold and think strategically. I observed him, the way he shifted his weight, the way he leaned on his friends for validation, the subtle arrogance in his tone. Every move he made was predictable, and yet, in his mind, he was untouchable. That arrogance, I realized, was my leverage. As the afternoon stretched on, the air thick with the smell of grilling meat and the low buzz of conversation, I started noticing the little things that had always gone unremarked. The way Mom kept stealing glances at him, like she was proud of this version of her son that seemed to shine effortlessly in public. The way Dad nodded approvingly at every word Alex spoke, ignoring the fact that I'd been the one quietly fixing his collapsed folding chairs earlier in the morning. Cousins whispered to each other, occasionally glancing at me with that mix of sympathy and amusement, the kind that only reinforced the divide between Alex and me. Each observation stoked the fire inside me, transforming old resentment into a sharper, more deliberate focus. By the time the sun started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the backyard, I had made a decision. I wouldn't play the background role any longer. I wouldn't let Alex dictate my place at the table, in the family, or in life. But I also knew that whatever I did, it had to be precise, calculated. Impulsiveness had never worked in my favor. I had to wait, watch, and choose the perfect moment to tilt the scales in my favor. For now, I simply smiled, lifted my glass, and let Alex prattle on, acting like the world revolved around him. But inside, I was already planning, and I could feel that quiet, steady thrill that comes when you realize you're finally ready to stop being the passive observer of your own life. As twilight settled over the yard, the mood remained deceptively calm. Laughter echoed faintly from the group gathered around Alex, and I sat in my chair, feeling the summer heat mixed with anticipation. The first subtle cracks in the facade had begun to appear. Alex was overconfident, everyone else was distracted by his antics, and I had the patience to wait. For the first time in years, I wasn't just enduring, I was plotting. And little did anyone know, the balance of power in this family, long assumed to favor Alex, was about to shift, but the shift wouldn't be chaotic or reckless. It would be precise, and it would be satisfying. Then came the moment that really set everything in motion, though no one yet realized its significance. The waiter from the catering service, a quiet young man with a clipboard, approached the table with the final bill. I didn't notice at first, too absorbed in the simmering tension around Alex, but the waiter's eyes flicked in my direction, and something unspoken passed between us. A recognition, a silent acknowledgement that I was not to be underestimated. When the total was announced, I felt my pulse quicken, because it wasn't just a number, it was a key, a figure that would, in time, become the first domino in a sequence of events that would change everything. The sum was staggering, absurd even, $3,700. Alex looked up, confused, a small frown breaking through his confident mask. The table murmured, unsure what to make of it, and I just sat back, letting the moment stretch. Finally, I smirked, a slow, deliberate expression that carried far more meaning than words. "Not my seat," I said softly, almost to myself, but loud enough for the waiter and Alex to hear. And in that instant, the air shifted. Laughter died down, glances sharpened, and I realized that the first step in reclaiming my place in the family, and maybe teaching Alex a lesson he'd never forget, had begun. After I delivered that simple line, "Not my seat," there was a peculiar silence that stretched across the backyard. Alex froze mid-laugh, his friends stopped their whispering, and even the kids chasing each other around the yard paused for a moment, sensing that something important had just happened. The waiter, young and polite, shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the tension he had stumbled into. I didn't rush to explain, didn't offer any clarification. I just leaned back in my chair, letting the smirk linger on my face long enough for it to unsettle Alex. It was subtle, but I could see the small flicker of irritation cross his features. That flicker would grow, I knew, into something that could be manipulated. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of small provocations and quiet observation. Alex, clearly stung, tried to reclaim the spotlight, but his movements were slightly off. The jokes he made landed flat. The stories he told were punctuated by awkward pauses. Every once in a while, I caught him glancing at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and barely contained frustration. It was almost laughable, the way he seemed unsure how to respond to someone who refused to shrink in his shadow. And yet, even as I enjoyed this subtle power shift, I was aware of my own simmering anger. For years, I had endured his arrogance, the preferential treatment from our parents, the small humiliations that piled up into a mountain of resentment. I'd been patient, but patience only took me so far. Dinner came and went with the usual clamor. More burgers, more potato salad, more laughs at Alex's expense. But the subtle cracks in our family dynamic continued to widen. Mom hovered over him as he claimed the chair closest to the grill, laughing at every word he said, while Dad clapped him on the shoulder in silent agreement. I noticed the way they glanced at me only when necessary, their attention drawn like gravity toward Alex. It wasn't a surprise, really, but it stung sharper than it ever had before. I tried to remind myself that their favoritism wasn't malicious, at least not consciously. They simply never noticed my side, the quieter, less flamboyant Michael who had spent years keeping things smooth while Alex shined. But the sting of invisibility was more acute than usual, maybe because now I was no longer willing to accept it. As the sun dipped lower, the backyard seemed to shrink. The laughter became louder, a bit more forced, as the party moved toward games and casual competitions. Alex suggested a simple cornhole match, naturally assigning himself the role of team captain. "Come on, guys, let's make this fair," he said with that self-important grin of his, "but I call first pick. Can't have anyone falling behind." I wanted to ignore him, but a strange mixture of irritation and resolve forced me to respond. "I'll play," I said calmly, keeping my tone neutral. "Somebody has to beat you eventually." A ripple of laughter followed, but not directed at me, at least not overtly. Alex's friends exchanged glances, and I noticed the subtle shift. He hesitated, maybe for the first time all day, before assigning me a team. His smirk faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly with a forced laugh. "Sure, why not? Just don't get in the way, all right." That's all it took. I let the words roll over me, recording every syllable, every condescending tone. I could feel the familiar tightness in my chest, the anger that had been simmering for years, but now it was no longer blind fury. It was precise, deliberate, controlled. The match itself was deceptively simple, but I played with a focus that surprised even me. Every throw, every glance, every movement was deliberate. I wasn't just playing cornhole. I was observing, cataloging Alex's reactions, noting how quickly he became flustered when things didn't go perfectly according to his plan. His friends started to murmur, noticing the uncharacteristic strain on his face, and that small ripple of uncertainty only fueled my own determination. By the third round, it was clear that I wasn't just holding my own. I was winning, and Alex was visibly unnerved. His laugh, once confident, now had an edge of desperation. That evening, as the shadows grew longer and the air cooled, the subtle tension reached a peak. Mom suggested we move to the deck for dessert, and Alex immediately claimed the chair at the head of the table. Without thinking, I followed, selecting a seat that put me directly across from him. It was a small, almost invisible act, but I noticed the flicker of recognition in his eyes, an acknowledgement that I was no longer the passive participant he assumed me to be. Dessert was served, a mix of pies and custards that Mom insisted were her finest creations, and conversation resumed, but it was strained. Alex was still trying to regain control, but his usual charm felt forced, his usual confidence slightly frayed. And then it happened, the moment that would change everything. One of Alex's friends, a girl named Clara, leaned in during a lull in conversation and whispered something that I only caught because my curiosity made me eavesdrop. At first, I didn't process it fully, just filed it away as a casual remark. But as the words sank in, my stomach dropped. She wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking about me, quietly, just loud enough for me to hear if I listened closely. He thinks you're still going to sit quietly forever, huh? He doesn't even realize you've been planning something. My pulse quickened. Planning something? What did she mean? I scanned the table, but Alex was busy talking over someone else, oblivious to the whispered exchange. Clara, noticing my glance, smiled faintly, a secretive expression that suggested she had just handed me a key piece of information without me asking for it. And that's when it hit me, the betrayal that would shatter my patience completely. My parents, my cousins, everyone sitting around the table had always dismissed me, ignored me, or laughed at Alex's antics. But I hadn't realized the depth of their complicity until this exact moment. They weren't just failing to notice. They were actively invested in keeping me in my place. I felt a surge of disbelief, anger, and clarity all at once. Years of quiet indignities, moments of being sidelined, being the background Michael, had been reinforced not just by Alex, but by the people who were supposed to care about me the most. I stared at my parents, noting the subtle smiles, the nods, the way they laughed just a second too long at Alex's jokes. It was all part of a pattern, one I had always sensed but had never truly acknowledged in its full, ugly scope. The realization hit harder than any insult or slight from Alex alone. My own family had been complicit in my erasure. And just when I thought the evening couldn't get more absurdly frustrating, Alex leaned over with a faux friendly smile, pointing at my chair. Nice spot you picked, Michael. But don't get too comfortable. You know, this isn't really your table. Laughter followed, predictably, but this time it felt heavier, almost cruel. That's when something inside me broke. I had tolerated so many subtle humiliations, so many years of favoritism, and yet here was my brother, still assuming he had the right to dictate my place in my own family's gathering. The betrayal of my parents' silent complicity made the insult sting sharper than usual. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my drink, letting the moment stretch. I could feel all the pent-up frustration, every moment I had been ignored, every opportunity one had been denied, coalescing into a single, precise clarity. This wasn't just about a chair or a cornhole match or a family barbecue. This was about respect, about finally making my presence impossible to ignore. And if Alex, or anyone else, thought I was going to let him continue with his antics unchecked, they were about to learn otherwise. The first act of planning began in that moment, quiet, internal, almost invisible. I would not react impulsively, not yet. I would wait, observe, and calculate. Every misstep Alex made, every overconfidence-driven assumption, every small betrayal would be cataloged, remembered, and leveraged. I realized that the only way to truly claim my place, and maybe, finally, force my family to see me as more than a background character, was to turn the situation on its head. But even as I sat there, calm on the surface, my mind racing beneath, the air suddenly shifted again. I didn't notice it at first. The subtle way Alex's friends began whispering, the glance from Clara that suggested she had just set something in motion, but then the real betrayal became undeniable. My parents, who had smiled indulgently at Alex's jokes all afternoon, now laughed at something I had said, a simple, harmless remark I had made in passing. Their laughter wasn't warm or affectionate. It was dismissive, condescending, mocking. It was the first time I had been openly laughed at in front of the entire family in years, and it cut sharper than any slight Alex had ever delivered. I froze. My hand tightened around my glass, my knuckles whitening. The betrayal wasn't just Alex's anymore. It was my parents' too. The realization hit me like a punch. Not only had they failed to protect me from years of condescension and favoritism, they were now actively participating in it. The hot anger that had simmered quietly for years boiled over, but I didn't let it show. I just smiled, a slow, controlled smile, and thought, this changes everything. Everything I thought I knew about family, about loyalty, about respect, was about to be put to the test. And I would make sure that the next move, the first real move, would be mine. The night ended with small talk, a few goodbyes, and Alex's smug grin as he strutted off to his car with his friends. But inside, the tension had reached a breaking point. The quiet simmer of resentment, the slow, methodical awareness of betrayal, and the sharp sting of recognition that my parents were complicit had created a perfect storm. I knew, deep down, that whatever happened next, the dynamics of our family had irrevocably shifted. And somewhere, in the back of my mind, a plan began to take shape. A careful, deliberate strategy that would ensure that years of disrespect, favoritism, and betrayal would not go unanswered. But I wasn't ready to act yet. The fire was lit, the pieces were in place, and the tension had become unbearable. I could feel the first real step toward reclaiming my dignity and power forming, but it would have to wait. Timing, as I had learned over the years, was everything. The breaking point had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same. The days after that family barbecue were hard. More than hard, they were disorienting, a strange combination of humiliation, anger, and a sense that I had finally seen my family for what they were. The laughter at my expense, Alex's smug triumph, and my parents' complicity clung to me like an invisible weight. I tried to carry on with normal life, but everything felt heavier, the world somehow sharper and less forgiving. I couldn't stop replaying their faces, the way they had dismissed me in front of everyone, the way Alex had practically strutted away with the smug confidence of someone who had just won a war I didn't even realize I was fighting. I went to work that Monday feeling hollow. I manage a small department in a local marketing firm, and normally I take pride in my efficiency and problem solving. But that week, I couldn't focus. Every email I sent felt hollow. Every meeting a performance I couldn't fully inhabit. I kept thinking about the chair, about the laughter, about the absurd $3,700 bill I had smirked at, but that had felt symbolic of so much more. The cost of my invisibility in my own family. The incident didn't just sting, it shook me to my core. For the first time in years, I realized how much of myself I had silently given away to avoid conflict, to maintain peace, to keep the illusion that my family loved me equally. And now I couldn't unsee it. The first few nights were the hardest. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying snippets of that day. Alex leaning back in that wobbly chair, his friends whispering, my parents laughing. The betrayal cut deeper each time I revisited it. I felt small, insignificant, invisible, the exact role I had spent decades trying to shrug off. There was a part of me that wanted to lash out, to confront Alex, to scream at mom and dad for their complicity. But experience had taught me that impulsiveness only led to regret, and this time, I wanted something different. I wanted power, control, and the satisfaction of not just being acknowledged, but being feared, respected, even envied. So I began quietly. Step 1 was self-assessment. I needed to understand exactly what had gone wrong in my life that allowed this dynamic to persist. I realized that over the years, I had allowed my own self-worth to be dictated by others. I had sought approval from my parents, validation from my brother, and yet I had rarely stood up for myself. I had accepted their hierarchy silently, hoping that eventually, my patience or reliability would earn recognition. But now, after seeing their true colors, I understood that recognition would never come from them. It had to come from me. The next step was subtle rebuilding. I started small. I reorganized my apartment, creating a space that felt entirely mine, a sanctuary where I could think clearly and plan. I spent evenings reading books on negotiation, psychology, and strategy, studying not just business tactics, but the subtle art of influence and power. I joined a few professional networking groups, ones I had always considered out of reach because I thought I wasn't charismatic or bold enough. Slowly, cautiously, I began putting myself into spaces where I could grow, away from my family's shadow. At work, I took on projects that others avoided, ones with high visibility and high stakes. I didn't shout about my contributions, but I made sure that results were undeniable. I documented everything meticulously, keeping records of successes, numbers, and feedback. Every presentation, every meeting, every proposal was executed with precision. The thrill of competence, of finally seeing tangible proof of my capabilities, began to replace the gnawing resentment I had carried since the barbecue. I realized I didn't need my family's approval to validate me. I needed only my own standards, and perhaps, one day, the satisfaction of letting them realize just how much they had underestimated me. Socially, I started being selective. Alex's friends had always hovered around him, feeding into his ego and reinforcing my invisibility. I began connecting with people who appreciated intelligence, reliability, and subtlety. I found allies who didn't just laugh at his jokes or cheer his victories. They saw the work I did behind the scenes, the thoughtfulness I brought, the quiet strength that had always been ignored. Slowly, my confidence grew. It wasn't loud or brash. It was steady, an internal flame that refused to be extinguished. The hardest part, though, was dealing with the emotional fallout. There were nights when I wanted to pick up the phone and call mom or dad, to demand recognition or apology. I wanted to confront Alex directly, to make him feel the discomfort he had caused me for so many years. But I didn't. I realized that confrontation without preparation would only play into his hands. I needed leverage. I needed patience. I needed a plan that would allow me to rise above, not just react. That realization, though frustrating, became empowering. I understood that my ascent couldn't be impulsive. It had to be strategic, precise, and undeniable. In the midst of rebuilding, an unexpected ally emerged. Clara, the friend who had whispered that subtle warning at the barbecue. I hadn't spoken to her directly yet, but we connected online, exchanged messages about work, life, and ambitions. Her perspective was invaluable. She didn't just see me as Alex's overshadowed older brother. She saw potential, capability, and cunning. From her, I learned to view the situation differently, not just as a personal slight, but as a puzzle, one where patience and careful moves could yield maximum effect. She didn't offer solutions. She offered insight, subtle nudges that sharpened my perspective. Financially, I began to take small, deliberate steps to secure my independence. I had been frugal before, but now every choice had purpose. I reviewed investments, adjusted savings, and began exploring opportunities one had previously ignored, from side projects to small entrepreneurial ventures. Each success, no matter how minor, reinforced the growing sense of control I had over my own life. I was no longer waiting for validation from my family. I was building a life that could eventually make their recognition irrelevant. Meanwhile, my observation of Alex continued, though from a distance. I noticed how overconfident he remained, how little he seemed to consider the consequences of his arrogance. I watched social media, noting his small triumphs, his missteps, the subtle cracks in his polished persona. Every instance of carelessness, every moment of prideful overreach, became a piece of information, a building block for the strategy one was slowly constructing. My emotions, once reactive and volatile, had become tools. Anger was now energy. Frustration became focus. The humiliation of the barbecue, of years of favoritism and condescension, was being transformed into something powerful, preparation. As weeks turned into months, I began to feel a strange mix of satisfaction and anticipation. The hard work was paying off, not just in results, but in a growing internal sense of dignity and self-worth. I no longer felt the need to prove myself to anyone who had ignored me. Instead, I was building a foundation from which my eventual moves would be undeniable. My patience was no longer passive. It was deliberate, a quiet force that promised eventual vindication. But the real turning point came unexpectedly. One evening, I received an invitation to an industry conference, a high-profile event that Alex, and, more importantly, my parents would never consider attending. It was a subtle chance to network, to make connections, to establish myself in spaces they assumed I had no access to. I knew then that the slow climb I had undertaken was reaching a critical stage. The opportunities one had been quietly creating, the competence I had been demonstrating, and the strategic patience I had cultivated were converging. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was positioning myself to rise above the family dynamics that had held me captive for decades. And yet, even as I celebrated these quiet victories, I remained acutely aware of the ticking clock. Alex's arrogance, my parents' favoritism, the subtle betrayals, they had created a combustible environment. One misstep, one careless moment, could undo the careful work I had done. I had to remain vigilant, patient, and precise. My rise would not be public or flamboyant. It would be methodical, deliberate, and undeniable. The rock bottom of that barbecue had been painful, humiliating, and almost unbearable. But from it, I had begun to rebuild, not with the chaos of emotion, but with the quiet certainty of strategy, foresight, and deliberate action. Every success, every small victory, every calculated step forward became part of a larger plan. Alex, my parents, and even the extended family had underestimated me for too long. They didn't know that the Michael they had always ignored was already plotting, already preparing, and already building the foundation for a reckoning they would never see coming. And in that quiet, unassuming way, I realized that the true power didn't come from shouting, from arguing, or from immediate retaliation. It came from patience, planning, and the kind of silent confidence that makes others underestimate you at their own peril. The fire had been lit, the pieces were moving, and the rise from the ashes had begun. The only question left was how high I could climb, and how completely I could ensure that those who had wronged me would finally recognize the price of their dismissiveness. By the time the next summer rolled around, I had become almost unrecognizable, not in appearance, but in presence. Inside, I had shifted from someone who endured to someone who observed, analyzed, and planned with a precision that made my previous life seem like a distant memory. My confidence no longer wavered. My sense of self-worth had hardened into a quiet armor, and the humiliation of that barbecue, along with years of condescension from Alex and my parents, had become fuel for a larger purpose. I wasn't looking for petty revenge anymore. I was constructing something deliberate, intelligent, and unavoidable. The first step in executing any plan is, after all, observation, and I had spent months watching, cataloging, and quietly noting every flaw, arrogance, and overconfidence that Alex and my family displayed. It started with small things, conversations I overheard during family gatherings, subtle slips in judgment Alex made when he assumed everyone around him was docile, the way my parents continued to reward his shallow displays of charm while dismissing my efforts and accomplishments. I didn't respond or challenge, at least, not yet. That would come. For now, I compiled everything mentally, like a blueprint of vulnerabilities. Every misplaced boast, every moment of arrogance, every laugh at my expense was filed away as ammunition. By the time my plan was ready, these would be the points where I would strike with precision. I also began to quietly gather allies. Some were obvious, some less so. Clara remained a key informant, not just a friend, but someone who understood Alex's social patterns, his overconfidence, and the way his friends and our extended family reinforced his sense of entitlement. She offered insight, subtle nudges that confirmed my observations, but she never interfered directly. She gave me context and perspective, how Alex's network operated, how my family unconsciously enabled him, and how even minor disruptions could ripple into chaos if introduced strategically. I realized that leverage wasn't just about exposing flaws. It was about carefully orchestrating circumstances where those flaws would lead to public consequences. Professionally, I continued to consolidate my position. At work, my projects began gaining recognition beyond my immediate department. I attended high-profile conferences, networked with influential people in my industry, and quietly built a reputation for reliability, insight, and strategic thinking. Every success became a quiet signal, not just to me, but to the world that I was competent, capable, and untouchable. Most importantly, I knew that when the time came, these successes could be used in the context of family dynamics, not braggadocio, but undeniable evidence of a life I had built despite their dismissiveness. Alex and my parents assumed I existed on their periphery. That assumption was about to be dismantled. Financially, I positioned myself carefully. I had saved strategically over the past year, cutting unnecessary expenses and redirecting resources into opportunities that could amplify my influence. Investments, side projects, and even small entrepreneurial ventures allowed me to gain independence, creating leverage in ways Alex would never expect. While he flaunted superficial victories, boats, gadgets, summer trips, my strategy was deeper, long-term, and sustainable. I wasn't chasing immediate validation. I was building a structure that would, when fully realized, force recognition and perhaps even admiration, whether they were willing to offer it or not. But the most critical aspect of my preparation was psychological. I needed to refine patience into an art form. Every interaction with Alex and my family became an exercise in observation, restraint, and subtle manipulation. I studied their responses, learned their triggers, and began to experiment with small nudges, comments, gestures, suggestions that would later amplify the chaos I intended to unleash. The key was subtlety. A misstep, an overreaction, or premature exposure of my plan could destroy months of preparation. Every move had to be measured, deliberate, and nearly invisible until the final reveal. Family gatherings became the perfect stage. I began attending more, but differently. No longer timid or eager for approval, I maintained a quiet confidence. I arrived early, prepared to watch and listen. I observed Alex's patterns, how he claimed authority over seating arrangements, how he monopolized conversations, how he relied on the implicit agreement that no one would challenge him. I noticed the small ways he assumed compliance, the micro-expressions of entitlement that betrayed his overconfidence. These observations were cataloged, mentally recorded for later use. I also began planting seeds of disruption. Small comments, almost casual, designed to be remembered and interpreted later in my favor. For example, I might compliment one of Alex's minor achievements in a way that subtly implied that I had the capacity to achieve far more if I chose to. Or I would ask a pointed, polite question during conversation that forced him to justify a boast he assumed no one would scrutinize. Each interaction was calculated, a test of his arrogance, a probe for weaknesses, a subtle undermining of the untouchable persona he relied upon. Over time, these microacts began creating cracks in his confidence. He didn't notice, or if he did, he dismissed them with a laugh that I knew was slightly forced. But the cracks were there, and when the time came, they would widen under pressure. One evening, after another family dinner where Alex had once again commandeered the head of the table, I noticed the perfect opportunity, a small, seemingly inconsequential slip that would later have outsized consequences. He bragged about a friend's successful business venture, embellishing the story in a way that revealed a basic misunderstanding of financial risk. Everyone laughed politely, assuming his authority was unimpeachable, but I recognized the flaw immediately. It was minor in isolation, but in context, it was a lever I could use. I made a mental note, filing it away as future ammunition. Clara, sensing my focus, sent me a private message later that night. "You're calm, but you're not just calm, you're calculating. Keep noticing, keep collecting. He's going to give you what you need, just don't touch it yet." Her words resonated. I had spent so long reacting, waiting for the right moment, that I now understood the power of anticipation. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about timing, leverage, and inevitability. I needed Alex to continue his arrogance, my parents to continue their favoritism, and my family to remain oblivious. Only then would the structure I had built come crashing down with maximum impact. Over the next several months, I maintained this rhythm: observe, plant, reinforce, grow. I cultivated allies outside the family, refined my professional standing, and continued developing a quiet reputation for competence and insight. Each small success bolstered my confidence, and each minor disruption in Alex's assumed dominance reinforced my strategic approach. I was no longer the overlooked sibling. I was the architect of an eventual reckoning, quietly gathering the tools I would need to execute it flawlessly. The brilliance of my approach was its invisibility. To the untrained eye, I was simply living my life, attending work events, networking, occasionally visiting family, and engaging socially in ways that appeared normal. But every conversation, every glance, every seemingly casual action was calculated. I cataloged behavior, noted weaknesses, and identified the points where overconfidence, favoritism, and entitlement intersected, exactly the points I would later exploit. Then, finally, the moment came when preparation converged with opportunity. Alex, still unaware of the slow but steady undermining of his confidence, had invited the entire extended family to another gathering, promising an elaborate summer barbecue of his own. He had, predictably, assumed the role of center stage, boasting about the menu, the music, and the seating arrangements. My parents, predictably, deferred to him, offering praise and validation while barely acknowledging my presence. But this time, I wasn't just present, I was ready. I arrived early, casually, observing every detail: the placement of chairs, the flow of food, the subtle social dynamics that Alex assumed were immutable. Everything was visible, every flaw cataloged, every opportunity noted. I was calm, controlled, patient, confident. Every member of the family was falling neatly into the patterns I had predicted, and I could feel the tension building. Not mine, but the tension I would soon introduce. And then, as Alex flaunted his dominance over the setup, his friends reinforcing his authority, I realized something critical. All the small actions I had taken over the past year, quietly building my reputation, observing patterns, planting seeds, creating leverage, were converging into a moment that could not be ignored. The balance of power, long assumed to favor him, was about to shift, and nothing he had done would prepare him for what was coming. My patience, my strategy, and my quiet rise from humiliation had placed me in a position where a single, well-timed move could topple the carefully constructed hierarchy of arrogance and favoritism that had dominated my family for years. Everything was ready. The pieces were in place. The setup was complete. And all that remained was the perfect moment to act, a moment that would change everything, not with chaos or impulsiveness, but with calculated inevitability. The question wasn't if I would execute it. It was when. The day had arrived. Alex's grand summer barbecue, his self-proclaimed event of the year, was set to be the stage for my long-awaited move. I arrived early, as I always did now, carrying nothing but my calm, unshakable confidence. My parents were there before me, bustling around in their usual fawning mode, congratulating Alex on everything from the perfectly arranged chairs to the playlist he had curated. I smiled politely, feeling no need for approval. I wasn't here to be acknowledged. I was here to execute. Every year of being overlooked, every condescending laugh, every subtle slight, they all converged into this precise moment. The backyard was immaculate, the tables perfectly aligned, the grill sizzling with the first batches of food. Alex was already performing, commanding attention, cracking jokes, and giving overly dramatic explanations about how he had planned this all himself. His friends hung on every word, laughing at every punchline. I watched him for a long moment, cataloging his arrogance, savoring the inevitability of the shift I had orchestrated. It was subtle, but the tension underneath his smile was already visible to me. I began by planting small seeds, seemingly casual comments that would trigger the unraveling. A few gentle remarks about safety with the grill. It's impressive how you're managing all this, but did you check the propane line? I remember a minor leak last year. A quiet question about seating arrangements that implied my awareness of the potential chaos if things were moved haphazardly. No one else noticed the hints, but Alex did, and his slight tightening of the jaw and forced grin were exactly what I had been waiting for. Next came my professional leverage. Months ago, I had cultivated contacts with several high-profile suppliers, event coordinators, and catering services without Alex or my parents noticing. I had quietly arranged for a small inspection of the grill setup under the guise of providing safety guidance from an industry perspective. When they arrived, I introduced them casually, noting, "I thought it might be helpful to have professionals look things over before the crowd arrives." My parents, naturally, deferred to me, perhaps the first time in decades that they actually followed my lead. Alex, of course, bristled. He smiled, nodded, and laughed, but I could see the subtle panic behind the performance. As the inspection progressed, small problems began to surface. Minor but undeniable errors in Alex's setup, oversights he had assumed would go unnoticed, were now pointed out by professionals he couldn't argue with. A wobbly table, an unbalanced grill, improper propane connections, all minor, individually, but collectively undeniable. Alex's voice, which had been so commanding and confident just minutes before, began to strain under subtle critique. His friends exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or worry, and my parents' eyes shifted between Alex and me in a way I had never seen before: respect, recognition, and a flicker of guilt. The next phase was psychological. I had coordinated a small social reveal that would capitalize on Alex's growing unease. I had spent months connecting with our extended family members outside these gatherings, subtly sharing stories of my professional accomplishments, my strategic successes, and even minor victories in ways that seemed casual but carried weight. Now, at the barbecue, I allowed those stories to surface naturally. Conversations with cousins, a few well-timed compliments about my career, and quiet acknowledgments of my achievements began to ripple through the gathering. Every mention, every nod, every quiet recognition chipped away at the pedestal on which Alex had been placed for decades. By mid-afternoon, the subtle pressure was building, and I knew it was time for the final piece. I had arranged for a small, friendly challenge among cousins and friends, a cornhole tournament, seemingly innocuous but carefully designed to expose Alex's overconfidence. I volunteered last, claiming to join for fun, and immediately noticed the shift in dynamics. Alex, naturally, claimed the position of team captain, assigning players and orchestrating the game with over-the-top theatrics. But this time, the careful observations, the years of cataloged arrogance, became my advantage. I deliberately chose my team, including a few allies who had become quietly aware of my strategy, and positioned them to maximize subtle psychological pressure. The match began, and everything unfolded exactly as I had envisioned. Alex's initial throws were slightly off, not catastrophic, but noticeable to anyone paying attention. His friends, who had previously bolstered him unquestioningly, began exchanging subtle expressions of doubt. I, on the other hand, remained calm, precise, and focused. Every throw was deliberate, every point calculated. When I finally made a difficult shot, perfectly landing in a tricky position, a ripple of surprise passed through the crowd. Alex's composure faltered, his laugh a touch forced, his smile tight. Small whispers started among his friends, and I realized that the tide had turned. The crowning moment came in the final round. Alex, desperate to reclaim his pedestal, attempted a high-risk throw, a move he had practiced for years but had never executed under pressure in front of an audience. I had noted the flaw in his technique months ago. As he launched the beanbag, it sailed just slightly off target, clattering into the edge of the board. The reaction was instantaneous. His friends gasped, his parents tensed, and I felt the satisfaction of inevitability. I executed my final throw with calm precision, securing a narrow but undeniable victory. The applause, tentative at first, grew louder as my team celebrated. Alex's face turned red, not from exertion, but from recognition. He had underestimated me, ignored my potential, and dismissed every effort I had made for years. Now, in front of the family, the friends, and the carefully arranged audience of subtle allies, his pedestal crumbled. My parents, who had always deferred to him, now looked at me with a mixture of surprise and respect. The shift wasn't dramatic, loud, or chaotic. It was quiet, undeniable, and humiliating for Alex. After the game, I allowed a few casual, pointed remarks to land. I never realized how tricky cornhole could be under pressure, I said lightly, letting my tone convey both humor and confidence. It's amazing what practice and focus can achieve. My parents nodded subtly, and even a few of Alex's friends smiled, perhaps realizing for the first time that I was more than the background character they had assumed I would always be. Alex said nothing. His usual witty comebacks, his attempts to assert control, were gone. He was deflated, exposed, and undeniably human in a way he had never allowed himself to be in public. Dinner that evening continued, but the dynamics had shifted irreversibly. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer the overlooked sibling. My parents' subtle deference, the way they engaged with me, and the quiet recognition from extended family and friends reinforced the new balance. Alex attempted to recover, but the cracks in his persona, now exposed to a carefully cultivated audience, were impossible to repair. I had orchestrated the perfect combination of psychological leverage, social dynamics, and professional credibility to ensure that he, and by extension, my family, could not dismiss me again. By the end of the night, I had achieved something far greater than victory in a game or a moment of social triumph. I had claimed my place, not through chaos, argument, or dramatics, but through patience, strategy, and the quiet, deliberate accumulation of power and recognition. The satisfaction wasn't loud or brash. It was steady, deep, and irreversibly earned. I watched Alex walk away, his friends trailing behind, and my parents glanced at me with expressions that were equal parts surprise and acknowledgement. I didn't need to say a word. Everything had been communicated through action, through the careful orchestration of circumstance, and through the undeniable display of competence, calm, and strategy. As I leaned back in my chair that night, watching the sunset cast long shadows across the backyard, I felt an immense sense of closure. The humiliation, favoritism, and years of quiet erasure were finally met with consequence. Not chaotic, impulsive revenge, but a measured, intelligent, and undeniably effective reclamation of my dignity. I had risen from the background to a position of recognition and power, and there was no turning back. Alex, my parents, and the extended family could no longer ignore me, and the lessons of my past would resonate every time they interacted with me in the future. I took a slow sip of my drink, feeling the cool evening air on my skin, and allowed myself a small, private smile. For decades, they had underestimated me. For decades, they had assumed I would remain quiet, compliant, invisible. But I had changed the rules of the game, and now the only seat that mattered was mine. Quiet, deliberate, undeniable. Not because I demanded it, not because I shouted for it, but because I had earned it, meticulously, strategically, and with a patience that no one, not even my entitled, arrogant brother, could have anticipated. And in that moment, as the final laughter faded and the last scraps of food were cleared, I realized something profound. Sometimes the sweetest victory isn't in shouting, arguing, or forcing recognition. Sometimes it's in quietly building a life so undeniable, so competent, so unmistakably your own, that the world, and the people who once tried to diminish you, can no longer pretend you don't exist. I leaned back in the chair, perfectly stable this time, and thought to myself, this spot has always been mine. I'm Owen, 28, and I've always been the quiet one in my family. Not the let me tell you everything about my life type. More like the one who observes, who calculates, who lets people show their true colors. My parents, well, parents might be a generous term. I've always had this way of making every interaction feel like a performance where I was expected to applaud, not participate. Dad with his smirk that somehow made every sentence feel like a lecture, and Mom, who had this exhausting obsession with appearances and social status. And then there's my sister, Kara. She's 24, and from the outside, she seems harmless, bubbly, charming, the kind of person everyone likes immediately. But I've learned the hard way that charm can hide a whole lot of entitlement and greed. I'd always kept a very low profile financially. I've worked hard, saved cautiously, and made some smart investments my family didn't even know about, because telling them anything about my money was basically an open invitation to have it stolen or guilt-tripped out of me. And I was fine with that. I liked having some autonomy, even if it meant being invisible in family eyes. But apparently, invisibility isn't a shield against curiosity, especially from someone like Kara. It started innocently enough, or at least it looked innocent. Sunday brunch, the family's favorite tradition, was my moment to escape into small talk and avoid the usual barbs about career choices or why I wasn't married yet. I was sipping my coffee, minding my own business, when Kara slid onto the bench across from me with this smirk that immediately set my nerves on edge. "Owen," she said, leaning a little too close, "you've been acting weird lately. Something on your mind?" I gave her a neutral smile, thinking I could sidestep whatever she was fishing for. "Nothing much," I replied. But she didn't let it go. She has this way of tilting her head, looking at you like she can read your soul, and suddenly I felt that itch of panic that comes right before someone exposes you. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the French toast Dad had somehow charmed the waitress into making extra fancy today, when I noticed her subtle glances at my bag, the one I always keep close to me, with my important documents and a few personal items I'd rather not share. Then it happened. A casual, almost offhand question that was perfectly timed. "Owen, have you been doing anything interesting with money lately? I just feel like you've got a little stash or something," she said, spinning her toast around her fork like she wasn't really expecting an answer. But her eyes were sharp. Too sharp. I froze. My stomach dropped. She'd figured it out. Somehow, My careful secrecy wasn't enough. I tried to laugh it off, keeping my tone light. "Oh, just boring investments and stuff," I said, hoping she'd drop it. But Kara's smirk grew wider, the one that always spelled trouble. Boring, huh? That's weird, because I thought you'd be a little more generous with your family," she said, voice syrupy but dripping with intent. I could feel Dad's gaze on me then, half amusement, half expectation, the kind of look that makes you realize they've been waiting for your downfall for a while. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. I've learned over the years that saying anything at all usually makes it worse. Mom, ever the observer, chimed in, not because she cared, but because she saw an opportunity to assert control. "Family comes first, Owen. You know that," she said, her voice gentle, but there was steel underneath it. Dad laughed softly, and it wasn't the warm laugh of a family joke. It was the laugh of someone watching a spectacle unfold and enjoying the discomfort. By the time brunch ended, I was shaking slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden realization of how vulnerable I had become without even knowing it. I had never told them about my inheritance, never hinted at it, and yet, by the end of those 30 minutes, Kara's eyes had already found the spot where I kept my small safe at home. She hadn't asked to see it directly, of course. She didn't need to. There was a glint in her expression that told me she knew exactly what was waiting for her there. And somehow, the casual dinner chatter, the clinking of silverware, and the harmless jokes had all shifted into something dangerous, something calculated. I left the restaurant feeling the weight of it, the sense that everything I'd built quietly for myself was suddenly under siege. And deep down, I knew Sunday brunch wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The first move had been made, and it was only a matter of time before my careful life collided head-on with Kara's recklessness. That night, I went home and checked my safe discreetly. Everything was fine, untouched, for now. But the seed of panic had been planted. I couldn't shake the thought of her charm turning into audacity, of her expecting my money to be accessible simply because she wanted it. And as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized one uncomfortable truth. My family had always operated under the guise of love, but greed and entitlement ran deeper than any affection they ever showed. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound in the house felt amplified, every shadow suspicious. And when my phone buzzed with a message from Kara at 2 a.m., just an innocent, "Hey, just thinking about brunch. You okay?" My stomach twisted. Innocent? Hardly. The timing, the wording, the casual tone, it all screamed manipulation. She knew she had shaken me. She knew she had provoked that inner panic I worked so hard to suppress. By 5 a.m., I'd made a quiet decision. Not out of revenge yet, not because I wanted to escalate things immediately, but because I needed a plan. Kara couldn't be allowed to casually walk into my life and strip me of what I'd worked for. Dad's smirk and Mom's subtle warnings only strengthened my resolve. I wasn't going to react in the moment. I was going to wait, to observe, and then make every single move count. Little did they know, my calm demeanor and quiet habits weren't signs of weakness. They were preparation. I had spent years learning patience, reading people, understanding leverage, and now, every snide comment, every just family joke, every casual glance at my finances would be part of a much larger reckoning. I didn't speak to anyone that morning. I didn't need to. My mind was already racing ahead, mapping the moves that would ensure Kara, Mom, and Dad would regret underestimating me. And yet, even with all this mental planning, a cold fear lingered in the pit of my stomach. One misstep, one miscalculation, and my family would not only take my money, they could ruin everything I had quietly built. Sunday brunch had been the spark, but it was clear that the fire had only just started. Kara's sense of entitlement wasn't going to disappear, and the more I held back, the more I realized. She would push until she got exactly what she wanted. By the time the sun started rising, I had made my move. A small, quiet adjustment to my accounts. Nothing dramatic, nothing overt, but enough to alert me if anyone tried to access my money. It wasn't revenge yet. It wasn't even a confrontation. It was insurance, a test, a way to measure just how far Kara would go. And as I finished, staring at my phone's clock ticking to 5:17 a.m., I smiled quietly to myself. Soon, their phones would blow up. Soon, the facade of family first would crumble. And when it did, I'd be ready. The days after that Sunday brunch were unbearable in a way I hadn't anticipated. I thought maybe Kara would get bored. Maybe she'd leave my finances alone after realizing I wasn't going to give in so easily. I was wrong. Wrong in the kind of way that gnaws at you, makes your chest tighten every time she enters a room, and turns even mundane family interactions into exercises in patience and endurance. It started small, just little comments that were ostensibly innocent but loaded with judgment. "Owen, you really don't need to fuss so much about your little savings," Kara said one evening while we were helping Mom with grocery shopping. I was meticulously checking the receipt against the items, making sure the coupons stacked correctly. "It's not like anyone's going to steal from you. You have a lot, don't you?" She said it as casually as one might comment on the weather, but there was a sharp edge to it that made my stomach churn. I forced a smile and shook my head. "I just like keeping track. That's all." I didn't want to argue. I knew it would only escalate things. But Kara didn't stop there. She started lurking a little too close to my space. My desk when I left for the kitchen, my bedroom door ajar when she claimed she was just passing by. Every time, I reminded myself, patience, Owen. Observe. Wait. Mom and Dad seemed to sense the friction, but instead of stepping in, they fed it, subtle nudges that encouraged Kara's behavior without taking responsibility. "She's just worried about you," Dad would say, smirking as if her invasive habits were some sort of charming familial concern. Mom would chime in, "Well, we raised her to be careful with money. She's only looking out for you." Their words were coated in this veneer of love, but the implication was clear. They expected me to tolerate it, to be grateful, to play along with the narrative that Kara's entitlement was somehow a demonstration of care. I began to notice patterns. She didn't just want information, she wanted control. Every mention of my investments, every casual hint about a small purchase I might make, she transformed into leverage. The way she casually mentioned borrowing something here or there, always phrased as a favor, always punctuated with a smile that suggested she expected compliance. It made me sick. I started to dread family gatherings, even the briefest coffee breaks with my parents. The air felt thick, like I was walking through a room with invisible wires connected to every move I made. And then, the real escalation came. I had been careful, maybe too careful, leaving the safe locked and hidden, the combination known only to me. I thought I had covered every precaution. But one afternoon, I came home to find the lock slightly askew, the faintest scratch across the metal that I hadn't seen before. My heart stopped. I didn't touch it. I just stared. For a long moment, I replayed every interaction from the past week, every subtle glance, every lingering question about money, every tiny, almost innocent-seeming intrusion. And then it hit me. It had to be her. Kara had crossed the line. I wanted to confront her immediately, but something in me, maybe the years of watching my parents handle family drama, made me hold back. This wasn't just about proving a point in the moment. This was about seeing how far she would push before she realized she had bitten off more than she could chew. The breaking point came that Sunday. We were having another family brunch, the kind where everyone pretends life is perfect, where laughter masks tension, and where I had tried, naively, I now realize, to keep the peace. Kara was unusually chipper that morning, almost too casual. She kept asking questions about my plans, my finances, and whether I'd really need certain things for upcoming bills or investments. Dad was watching me closely, smirking every time Kara made a pointed remark. Mom was nodding politely, her eyes glinting with that calculated mixture of concern and amusement. I tried to ignore them, sipped my coffee, and focused on the plate in front of me. But then Kara leaned forward and, in the most casual tone possible, said, "You know, Owen, I just needed some cash for a little thing. I'm sure it's fine if I borrow a bit from your safe. It's not like it would matter." She glanced at me, her eyes sparkling with that mix of charm and entitlement that had always unnerved me. I froze. My mind raced, my chest tightened, and the room seemed to shrink around me. "Excuse me," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. I tried to keep calm, to keep control of the situation, but my insides were twisting. She laughed lightly, like my reaction was cute, like I was overreacting. "Oh, come on. I just need a little cash. I'll pay it back. It's not a big deal." And then I saw it. The moment I had feared but didn't fully believe would happen. Kara didn't just hint. She walked toward me, acting as if the safe was hers by right. My hands shook slightly as I gripped the edge of the table, trying to ground myself, trying to keep my voice steady. Kara, I said, deliberately calm, you do not touch my safe. You do not touch my money. Not now, not ever. She rolled her eyes, clearly thinking I was being dramatic, and that's when Dad chuckled, a low, knowing sound. Family always comes first, Owen, he said, the words dripping with irony. Mom nodded, smiling sweetly but saying nothing more. It was like they were daring me to act, like they were all in on it, enjoying the tension as a spectator sport. I said nothing. I couldn't. I felt the heat rising in my chest, the anger, the fear, the helplessness, all mingling into a cocktail that made my hands tremble. But deep down, I knew something had to change. I couldn't just let this happen. Not Kara, not Dad, not Mom. Not after years of carefully building a life that was mine. I knew I had to act, but not impulsively. I had to plan. I had to wait for the exact moment when their arrogance and entitlement would meet their comeuppance. By nightfall, the damage was done, or so I thought. I went to check my accounts, my safe, my carefully organized holdings, and that's when the betrayal became tangible, real, and gut-punching. $42,000 had vanished. My heart stopped. My stomach turned. Every precaution I had taken had been circumvented. She had done it. My sister, my family, the people who swore family comes first, had all colluded, either by action or passive approval. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply sat down, staring at the empty numbers blinking at me on my phone. Every scenario I had imagined was suddenly worse than reality. The audacity of it, the sheer disregard for boundaries, the confidence that they could act with impunity because they were family, it was staggering. And in that moment, a strange calm descended over me. A calculated calm, the kind that comes when you realize that while they may have stolen from you, they've also shown you exactly what you're dealing with. And then, the text started. First from Dad, short and condescending. Owen, we're family. Don't be difficult. Then from Mom, carefully phrased as if she were offering sage advice. We only did this because we care. You'll understand one day. Finally, from Kara, sweetly almost. Thanks for letting me borrow it. You're the best. The audacity of them all. Their messages were venom wrapped in velvet. I didn't respond. I couldn't, not yet. The storm had broken, the betrayal had occurred, and now I had to think, plan, and wait. Every instinct in me screamed for immediate confrontation, for fury, for retribution, but I knew better. I had to let them sit in their false sense of superiority a little longer, to let them believe they'd won. That night, I lay awake in bed, the house quiet around me, and I felt the full weight of my family's entitlement and greed. They had crossed a line I never imagined they would. My sister had violated trust, my parents had encouraged it, and I was left with nothing but the awareness of just how little they respected me. But I also felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control, justice, and making them understand, in a way they couldn't ignore, that actions have consequences, even within a family. By 5:17 a.m., I made a quiet move. Nothing visible, nothing dramatic. Just a simple, calculated adjustment to my accounts, a signal, a trap, a way to let the world, or at least their phones, announce the reckoning was coming. And I smiled. Soon, very soon, they would realize exactly what they'd done, and I would be ready to show them just how serious I was. But for now, I waited, savoring the anticipation. The betrayal had broken something fundamental between us, and it was only the beginning. I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't answer any messages. I let the silence grow, heavy and deliberate, knowing that every second they spent unaware was a second closer to the moment when I would take back what was mine and make them pay attention. The days after discovering the $42,000 gone felt surreal, like I was trapped in someone else's life. Every time I opened my accounts, the absence of that money hit me like a cold wave. But it wasn't just the money. It was the betrayal itself, the realization that my own family didn't see boundaries as anything more than suggestions. They had quietly, carefully, normalized the idea that they could take what they wanted from me and expect me to just accept it. It was suffocating. I spent the first few nights after the brunch sitting in my living room, staring at the locked safe that now felt useless, feeling a mix of anger, disbelief, and a deep, gnawing sadness I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. I realized quickly that I had two options: spiral into despair or start thinking like I always had, like I did when I wanted something and knew the only way to get it was to be methodical and patient. I wasn't just upset about the money. I was upset about the principle. I had built a life quietly, carefully, in my own way, and they had tried to dismantle it with a smile. But anger alone wasn't going to fix anything. I needed leverage. I needed a plan. The first step was emotional rebuilding. I stopped engaging with them entirely. No texts, no calls, no interactions at all. I changed my routine slightly to avoid running into Kara, and I even started leaving the house earlier than usual to avoid overlapping with my parents' morning rituals. The silence was heavy at first, oppressive, but slowly it began to feel like armor. I could breathe. I could think. I could remember that the world outside my family's orbit still existed, and that I wasn't defined by their greed or entitlement. Next, I turned my focus inward. I revisited the investments I had made quietly, looking for ways to optimize them, to rebuild what had been taken without drawing attention. Every evening, I pored over spreadsheets and account statements, analyzing patterns, calculating risk, and slowly crafting a strategy that would give me control, not just back over the lost funds, but over my own life. I began taking on small freelance projects, things I could do from home, things I could funnel into rebuilding the accounts Kara had raided. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't fast, but it was mine. Every dollar earned, every calculation double-checked, every late-night session staring at numbers on a screen, it felt like reclaiming a part of myself they thought they had destroyed. At the same time, I quietly started tracking Kara and my parents. I didn't spy, exactly, but I noted patterns, habits, little quirks that gave me insight into how they operated. Kara continued acting as if nothing had happened, throwing casual comments about my spending, my hoarding, and the needless obsession with money. Dad still smirked, occasionally dropping remarks about how generous Kara was being. Mom continued her subtle nudges toward reconciliation, all wrapped in soft, sweet words meant to disarm. The more they assumed I was passive, the more emboldened they became. I let them, carefully, silently, while documenting everything in my mind. Every slip, every careless comment, every boast. They didn't know it yet, but it would all matter later. Meanwhile, I started to focus on self-worth beyond financial security. I realized that my obsession with keeping the money safe had been partially about proving my independence to my family, but also partially about proving my value to myself and to the world. I began going back to the gym in the early mornings, working on my cardio and strength, not obsessively, but with a deliberate consistency. I returned to small hobbies I had neglected: photography, long walks through quiet neighborhoods, even cooking elaborate meals for myself, paying attention to details in a way my family had never appreciated. These small victories, the quiet moments of accomplishment, became a lifeline. They reminded me that I had worth outside of my inheritance, that I was more than the sum of what my sister or parents thought they could claim from me. Work became another pillar of rebuilding. I had always been competent, but now I leaned into competence with a kind of quiet ferocity. I networked carefully, seeking opportunities that wouldn't just replace the stolen funds, but would position me for long-term security and leverage. Slowly, my efforts compounded. Investments that had been steady began to grow faster with careful adjustments. Freelance projects brought in more than I expected. I didn't flaunt it, didn't tell anyone, but it felt good to see tangible proof that I could rebuild, that I could rise above the sabotage and entitlement that had threatened to derail me. But with the rebuilding came a new awareness, a sharper sense of the stakes. I began envisioning scenarios, not in anger, but in strategy. Kara was reckless and confident in her belief that I would always be passive. Dad and Mom reinforced that recklessness with their smirks, their casual remarks, their amusement at my supposed overreaction. I started imagining ways to turn their overconfidence against them. Every small action they took, every careless brag, every casual joke about family first, became fodder for a larger plan. Slowly, quietly, I began building the foundation for what would become more than just repayment of stolen money. I was beginning to plan accountability, the kind that couldn't be ignored or waved away with a smile. Emotionally, I felt myself shift. I wasn't just hurt anymore. I was calculating. I had moved past the initial betrayal and despair into a quiet, simmering resolve. The world had narrowed to a few key principles: patience, observation, and leverage. I didn't need to confront them immediately. I didn't need to shout or argue. I needed to let them expose themselves, to let their entitlement and overconfidence show the cracks in their facade. I was ready to wait, to watch, to gather the ammunition I would need to make them regret ever thinking they could take what was mine. At the same time, I found unexpected strength in independence. I realized that prior to this, my life had been defined in small part by the shadow of my family, by the expectation that I would bend to their whims and tolerate their overreach. Now, completely cut off from the $42,000, I had to rely entirely on myself. And I discovered something surprising. I was capable, resilient, and even resourceful in ways I hadn't fully appreciated before. Each night, as I closed my laptop after another long session of rebuilding accounts or planning projects, I felt a flicker of something new: pride. Not the pride of showing off, not the pride of earning recognition from them, but a quiet, grounded pride in my own competence and control. The juxtaposition of their ignorance and my quiet rebuilding gave me an almost intoxicating sense of potential. Kara had taken boldly, my parents had watched approvingly. And yet, their overconfidence became my secret weapon. They assumed my passivity, my compliance, my tolerance of betrayal. They assumed I would continue to play the good, quiet, invisible child. They assumed wrong. I began to plan methodically, the way I always had. Every phone call, every financial move, every encounter was logged mentally, analyzed for weaknesses and strengths, for opportunities to leverage, for moments where patience would yield maximum impact. And I started to anticipate the inevitable confrontation, not as an impulsive, angry act, but as a calculated, decisive move that would leave them reeling. One particularly quiet evening, as I sat at my desk reviewing investment statements and planning my next moves, I realized that what had started as recovery had already begun to feel like more than just regaining what was lost. It felt like building a foundation for something far larger. I wasn't just reclaiming $42,000. I was reclaiming control over my life, over my boundaries, over the way my family perceived me. And in that quiet, deliberate moment, I understood that the next time we interacted, nothing would ever be the same. But for now, the rise was silent. It was invisible. It was methodical. They went about their days, confident, oblivious, completely unaware that the tides were already turning. I watched, I waited, and I prepared. And as the weeks passed, every reckless action, every casual brag, every slip of entitlement became another brick in the foundation of what I was building. A comeback, a reckoning, and ultimately, a quiet, undeniable form of justice. By the time my phone buzzed one Sunday morning, the screen filled with a casual, "Hey Owen, any plans today?" from Kara, I didn't reply. I didn't need to. She had no idea that her actions had already set things into motion, that her overconfidence had just given me the perfect opportunity to turn the tables in ways they could never anticipate. And as I sipped my coffee, staring out at the city waking up, I felt that slow, satisfying thrill. The fall had broken me, but the rise had already begun, and when it fully arrived, it would be unmistakable. The first week after the theft had felt like quicksand, every instinct screaming to act, to confront, to demand justice out loud. But quiet had saved me. The weeks of rebuilding had taught me something else, too. Theatrics feed entitlement. If I wanted them to understand, really understand, I needed a plan that didn't look like a tantrum. I needed precision, timing, and a stage big enough that the embarrassment would land where it hurt the most. On their image, on the assumptions that gave them permission to steal in the first place. I began by turning what I knew about them into tools. Kara loved spectacle. She lived for the highlight reel. Mom lived for approval, for compliments from neighbors, friends, and the right people at the right charity events. Dad drank in the sense of being admired, the sly power of a well-timed smirk. Their public-facing arrogance was my map. If I could orchestrate a moment where their private cruelty contradicted their polished persona, there would be no easy way for them to dismiss it as a misunderstanding. No cute parently excuse. No family first, shrug to paper over the theft. The practical work was boring at first, the kind of slow, antiseptic labor I'd always preferred. I reopened accounts under slightly different names, routed small deposits in ways that looked legitimate to outside eyes, but would ping back to me if accessed. I set up discrete alerts, financial tripwires, that would notify me the second anyone moved cash through certain channels. Not flashy hacks or melodramatic schemes, just careful bookkeeping and an attention to detail that made it impossible for them to act without leaving traces. I used burner emails and throwaway messages for communications I didn't want traced back to me. I made sure every breadcrumb I laid out was either bait or evidence. The satisfaction I felt was measured and numeric, a steady line of spreadsheets filling in, a ledger of patience that felt like reclaiming a small, private sovereignty. I also built a circle, not because I wanted witnesses, though witnesses would be useful, but because I needed people whose competence would multiply the plan. There was Jonah, an old friend from college who worked IT security now and owed me a favor from a stupid group project we'd pulled off senior year. Jonah wasn't dramatic. He was meticulous and discreet, the sort of person who found comfort in logs and timestamps and the neat architecture of systems. When I explained the outlines, no illegal stuff, no break-ins, no doxing, just clever bait and precise documentation, he leaned forward, interested in the engineering of it. He helped me harden my digital traces and set up the alerts so that if anyone tried to cozy up to my accounts or my account's shadow copies, I'd know. Then there was Maya, an old colleague who now managed a boutique PR consultancy. She'd once told me she loved seeing people's narratives finally line up with who they were. To her, truth landing publicly was an art form. I didn't tell her everything, but I told her where I wanted the story to land. At a family brunch, at a charity event, wherever their performance was normally at its most polished. She advised on optics, how to make sure the humiliation would be unavoidable and sourced. Make them contradict their own script, she said. That's what people talk about. When the world sees a gap between what they sell and what they do, that's when the teardown happens. She was careful, too. No leaks, no grandstanding. She taught me how to make silence noisy, the kind of quiet that made people fill in the blanks for you, louder than any accusation. I kept a journal. Not the melodramatic Dear Diary stuff, but a forensic notebook where I logged interactions, times, offhand remarks, and small inconsistencies. Kara said something to a neighbor about helping out with a little problem, and later claimed she'd meant a friend. Dad said, "We did what had to be done." In a voicemail I recorded with a cheap recorder I kept in my wallet. Mom, in what I now recognized as her favored mode, left a trail of text messages that were performative apologies half-laced with passive aggression. All of these little things, when placed side by side, formed a pattern much larger than a missing sum of money. It painted them as a family who'd built a collective identity on entitlement and then weaponized that identity against the quiet kid. Patterns, I realized, made better cases than rage. I also started to rebuild my social credit. Quiet as I'd been, people outside my family had always respected me more than my relatives gave me credit for. I reached out to a few people who could be useful without letting anyone taste the plan. A small businessman I'd lent a hand to years ago agreed to let me use his office as a neutral meeting place. A broker I'd helped with a portfolio once was willing to draft a professional outreach email template, something that looked routine but would invite a response from my family if they tried to use the same channels to cover their tracks. Every person I enlisted understood the stakes without me needing to explain the entire story. They were pragmatic. They wanted to help and to see someone who'd been taken advantage of get his due. The bait had to be tempting enough to pull them out of complacency, but not so obvious that it would spook them. I designed it as a series of small, believable opportunities that would appeal to each of their particular appetites. For Kara, it was a faux investment in a community pop-up she'd mentioned, the sort of thing she liked to pin on social media as evidence of her philanthropic streak. For Mom, I created the illusion of an invitation to a high society bake sale committee, an event where appearances mattered and where Mom's social capital would be on display. For Dad, I floated the idea of a business pitch where he could be introduced as a family patriarch and entrepreneur, an ego stroke he couldn't resist. Each bait had its own affordance to be touched, to be boasted about, to display they were a close family patina that they loved to show the world. I also made sure to protect myself legally. I'm not a lawyer, but I knew enough to document everything in ways that would stand up if needed: screenshots, timestamps, receipts, a paper trail that mapped the theft onto their access and motivations. If this ever needed to move from social reckoning to legal action, I wanted the records to be so clear a rational mind would struggle to ignore them. Not because I wanted courtroom drama, though part of me did enjoy imagining my parents sitting under formal lights and being asked to explain themselves, but because clarity is its own kind of power. When you can show facts that contradict the myths a family tells about itself, the myth loses its grip. Everything, though, was paced. I tested. Small probes, a politely worded email asking about repayment plans sent to a burner account that was tied to my new alerts, a social media sighting posted by Maya that suggested a charity board was curious about our family's involvement. I was careful to let them take the initiative, to act first in their arrogance, so their behavior would be captured unfiltered. The worst thing would be to manufacture a confrontation. I wanted them to construct their own downfall by revealing what they already were. There were nights when the plan felt cold. I'd lie awake replaying interactions, worrying that I had become as calculating as the people I was trying to stop. But every time that doubt showed up, I reminded myself what they'd done: the breach of trust, the casual theft, the way they sat in brunches and smirked as if entitlement were a virtue. This wasn't about humiliation for its own sake. It was about consequence, teaching them that an assumption of impunity would have a price. And if the price included them having to look foolish in front of neighbors or acquaintances they used to measure themselves against, so be it. There was a strange moral symmetry in using the very public currencies they valued: face, reputation, social proof, to undo the private violence they'd committed. The small wins arrived quietly. Jonah called one morning with a report on the little digital traps we'd laid: a few login attempts at odd hours, a transfer that had been initiated but blocked by our newly created tripwire, a query from a banking IP that matched the region where Mom's tablet was registered. Each ping felt like a small, validation-laced heartbeat, evidence that they were poking at the edges, that my presence wasn't as invisible as they'd hoped. I didn't celebrate out loud. I logged the time and the method, and then I shifted attention to the next phase, making sure the eventual reveal would be clean and undeniable. Then came the human element, the friction point I'd been waiting for. People get careless when they can't see the consequences. They live off the currency of immediate satisfaction and social applause. One evening, at a neighborhood fundraiser where Mom was on the guest committee and Kara was there to flash her smile for pictures, Dad made a careless joke in front of the organizer about how family helps family. No questions asked. I watched from the back of the small, sunlit hall, notebook in my coat pocket, and the sentence hung in the air like an unspooled confession. The organizer laughed politely, then asked, almost offhand, "Oh, is there some family gift we should know about?" Dad's smile didn't falter. He was used to the applause. He lived in the reverberation of that laugh. I felt something tighten in me then, not anger, but a satisfaction at the exactness of the moment. They were still performing the role they'd always played: generous, moral, benevolent. The contradiction between that and what they'd done to me was getting sharper. I started to place the pieces for the public part of the plan: a plausible offer on social media that Kara would bite at, an email string that looked like business correspondence for Dad to forward without thinking, a request for Mom's name on a committee that would tie her public reputation to a private misdeed. All of it fed into a final tableau that would be obvious to anyone looking: a family that preached about community and care, caught appropriating someone else's money while smiling for the camera. The idea wasn't just to humiliate. It was to puncture the moral veneer that allowed them to rationalize their behavior. There were risks. People can double down when they're cornered. There was the chance they would lash out, call me dramatic, threaten to cut me off for making trouble, or try to spin the narrative into something that made me the villain. I planned for that, too. More documents, quieter backups, friends who could corroborate timelines. I mapped exit strategies should anything escalate outside my control. Control, I reminded myself, was the whole point. Controlling the narrative, the evidence, and, if necessary, the legal options. The setup took weeks. Each day felt like turning a screw, tightening until the machine would finally click. I felt myself changing in small ways. Less reactive, more deliberate, less desperate for familial approval, more committed to an ethics of reciprocity. The thing that had once felt like the rug being pulled from under me had become a laboratory where I tested patience and resolve. Then, one evening, while I was at my desk reviewing the last of the evidence, Jonah called with a soft laugh in his voice. "You should come by tomorrow morning," he said. "There's a little movement on one of your traps." My heart, which had settled into a steady rhythm over the past months, skipped. "What kind of movement?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. He didn't answer directly. "Just come by. Bring your notebook." He hung up before I could press him. I didn't sleep much that night. I imagined the sort of clumsy, arrogant mistake they were capable of, the kind that would provide the clean exposure I'd been designing toward. I pictured Kara bragging to a friend about how easy it had been to borrow from me, Dad forwarding an email that linked back to some shadow account, Mom slipping into a committee role and posting a photo that tied her to a false charity donation. All of these were plausible. All of them were the kind of human errors that could not be denied once they were on paper. At 6:30 the next morning, I walked into Jonah's small office, the city still hushed. He met me at the door with a cup of coffee and a stack of printouts. On the table lay a timeline, timestamps, IP addresses, a wire transfer trail that threaded directly to accounts linked to Kara and, embarrassingly, to a card my parents used at the same grocery chain. There were email headers, photographs of login attempts, and, most satisfying of all, screenshots of texts where Kara casually discussed borrowing the money to cover a small emergency. The evidence was clinical and damning. Jonah tapped the paper. "They were sloppy," he said. "They tried to use your old login details where you'd only changed one character decades ago. They used a shared password someone in the family still uses. The good news is they left a trail long enough to tie them to the transfers. The bad news is they probably think they've covered their tracks because they're family." I looked at the timeline, and for the first time since the theft, I felt the old hot knot of helplessness shift into a cool ember of power. We had them, not because I'd hoped for revenge, but because the truth, when gathered, organized, and presented, had a clarity that arrogance couldn't smother. I left Jonah's office with the prints in my bag and a plan in my head. The setup was complete. I had allies, evidence, and a staging area. A small neighborhood fundraiser where Mom would be prouder than usual, a charity gala where Dad wanted to be photographed with the mayor, and Kara's online social sphere hungry for her next philanthropic highlight. I pictured, with a clarity that made the old fear shrink, how the reveal could land. I also knew that the reveal would be messy, that they might react unpredictably. That risk made the next step essential. Timing. I scheduled nothing obvious. Instead, I synchronized actions, an innocuous email that would bait Dad, a PR nudge from Maya to the charity committee mentioning a large, anonymous donor, one earmarked in my plan to look like it came from me, and a private message to a mutual friend who adored Kara, asking if she would be willing to invite Kara to an informal lunch where we might discuss a small local project. Everyone in the chain thought they were doing favors or networking. No one suspected the orchestration. That afternoon, as I walked past the park where the fundraiser signs were going up, my phone buzzed with a single unread message from Jonah. They took it. They took the bait. "Be ready." My chest tightened not with panic, but with a thin, bright expectation. This was the moment I'd been building toward, the point where the carefully constructed stage would begin to tilt under their weight. I felt simultaneously light and heavy. Light because the sense of paralysis that had followed the theft was dissolving. Heavy because I knew what a public unraveling could do to people. I stood there for a long moment and breathed. Everything was in place. The evidence, the optics, the allies, and the bait. All that remained was the human factor. What they would do when confronted with the undeniable. I thought of Dad's smirk, of Mom's practiced apologies, of Kara's charming cruelty. I thought of my own quiet work, the nights hunched over spreadsheets, The early mornings at the gym rebuilding a sense of worth, the small friendships I'd rebuilt into a network of competence. Then, as the sun dipped and the people began to arrive at the fundraiser, my phone lit up again. A message from an unknown number, a photo of the event program, with Mom's name listed prominently under committee chair, and a caption from Kara, public, captioned, smiling, tagging Dad and the mayor. The photo was normal, ordinary, the kind of snapshot a family shares with pride. Beneath it, Jonah's message read, simply, now. I felt my pulse move into a higher gear. This was the turning point. The pieces were in motion. I walked toward the hall where the noise and chatter swelled, and for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. A quiet satisfaction that came from knowing the storm was no longer one I weathered alone. I stepped inside, the room warm and bright, and then I saw them. Mom adjusting a ribbon on her dress, Dad already in his polite, habitual pose, Kara flashing a practiced smile toward a camera. For a second, their faces were serene, untroubled. Then, at the far end of the room, a volunteer approached the podium with a stack of envelopes. My ally had decided to move. My pulse hitched. I reached for my notebook, the pages lined with months of small, careful cruelties and missteps, and felt the familiar steadiness return. This was where the setup met the act. This was where patience collided with spectacle. I inhaled and waited for the sound that would make the room shift. The crack of a microphone, a throat clearing, a name spoken into a quiet that would not allow for excuses. Then, just as the volunteer, someone Mom had known for years and trusted, began to speak, my phone buzzed again. It was a single word from Jonah. Play. And at that exact moment, somewhere at the edge of the hall, a thin, deliberate sound began to play from the volunteer's pocket. A recorded voicemail of Dad saying, in his casual, smirking way, words that matched the theft and the casual entitlement they used to excuse it. The room went still. I could feel the air change as if someone had turned the lights a fraction dimmer. Faces turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Mom's hand went pale on her ribbon. Dad's smirk faltered. Kara's smile, manufactured, rehearsed, stilled. And then, as I looked around the room at the faces of neighbors and acquaintances who had always seen my family as polished and upright, I realized the magnitude of what I'd set in motion. This was only the beginning. I never thought I'd want anyone to lose face the way I wanted my family to that night, but I'd spent months watching them trade other people's dignity like poker chips. They'd treated me like a coin you could spend and forget, and once you get used to that kind of treatment, the desire for them to understand, really understand, becomes quieter, sharper, and more insistent than anger. That's what I carried into the fundraiser. Not a lust for spectacle, but a precise hunger for consequence. When Jonah pressed play on that little file, Dad's voice on a voicemail, casual and amused, describing the helpful family loan, as if it were the most natural thing, it landed like a brick in a quiet room. For a handful of seconds, everything felt like slow motion. People who had nodded at Dad's jokes watched him process in the same way you watch a picture develop in a darkroom. An image forming that contradicts every story you'd been told about the people in it. Dad's first reaction was the old one, a reflexive smirk that tried to turn embarrassment into charm. It didn't work. The room had already heard his voice describe exactly what had happened, and afterward, when Jonah and I walked to the mic, when I stepped forward and started saying the words I'd practiced 1,000 times in my head, there was no comfortable, plausible deniability left. "Good afternoon," I said, keeping my voice steady, careful not to let the tremor underneath it show. "You all know my parents and my sister. They've been generous to this community in many ways. I'm not here to deny that. But generosity doesn't give you the right to steal from your son or brother. $42,000 went missing from my account. That money was transferred, in part, through accounts and cards linked to my family. I have copies of the transfers, timestamps, and communications showing their intent. I gave them one chance to make this right privately. They chose to treat it as a family matter. That's not a fix. It's theft paired with a performance. I'm handing out copies of the evidence. Decide for yourself." I watched faces change as copies were passed, the whispering started, and a woman 2 rows back, someone who'd once complimented my mother's charity cookies, folded the paper and stared at it for a long moment. Kara's face went white, then red, then pinched into a practiced anger I'd seen her try on before. Mom's hand trembled around her program. Dad, for the first time in my adult life, looked genuinely unsteady. What I hadn't expected was how quickly other people's voices would join mine. Maya, who'd volunteered quietly to be there because she knew those optics mattered, stood up and said what people who live in close communities often won't say to their neighbors' faces. We can't support boards or committees that profit off of exploiting someone in their own family. Her tone was careful, professional, the same one she used when advising clients on reputational risk. That sentence carried weight. People listened. Then, practical things happened with an almost procedural efficiency I hadn't planned for, but had quietly primed for. One of the volunteers, an accountant who knew Mom through the bake sale committee, looked at the transfers, looked at the people in front of her, and said, very plainly, "I'm calling the bank." Within an hour, a bank rep was on the phone with the event organizer, and by afternoon there were people from the bank standing in the hall, politely but firmly asking for account numbers and details. When banks see fraud and credible evidence, they act. I had spent weeks structuring my documentation to be legible and compelling. That legibility mattered now. By evening, a portion of the missing funds was frozen pending investigation. I won't say we recovered it all that day. Financial recovery is messy and often slow, but watching their comfortable accounts suddenly lose their immunity felt like watching a bubble pop. The social fallout was quicker and crueler. Mom's committee membership was suspended pending an inquiry. The mayor, who'd been photographed with Dad earlier that week, called his office to distance himself. Kara's employer reached out to ask about the allegations and whether a person representing the company as a community ambassador was the right fit. A couple of local charities politely declined the family's involvement in upcoming events. Neighbors who had once automatically invited my parents to barbecues started avoiding them with the kind of small, polite excuses people use when they don't want to be rude but don't want to get involved. The thin armor of social capital they'd used to justify everything cracked, and it revealed something brittle underneath. They lashed out in all the ways people who suddenly feel cornered do. Dad tried to pivot the narrative, forceful, loud, doing exactly what Jonah warned him not to do, positioning himself as the wounded party. Mom sent teary messages begging for privacy, framing everything as a misunderstanding and reminding people of how hard she'd worked for the community. Kara went public with a version of events that was part apology, part gaslight. "I was stressed," she wrote. "I did something stupid, and I thought it would be temporary." But the documents were already circulating in ways they couldn't control. Screenshots sent to journalists, copies left on doorsteps, printouts handed to committee members. You cannot gaslight a PDF. At home, the aftermath was worse. There's no theatrical way to show the slow erosion of a family except through the tiny, devastating things. The silence at meal times that used to be full of clatter and jokes, Dad's abrupt refusals to look at me, Mom's attempts to make tea and then not being able to say why she's crying. Kara's bravado crumbled in private the way it never would in public. I saw it when she called me one night, voice small. "Owen, I can fix this," she said. "I can." And then she stopped, because there is only so much that can be done once your reputation has been tied to something plainly wrong. People asked me, afterward, why I'd gone public at the fundraiser instead of taking the legal route immediately. The truth is complicated and boring. I wanted to see how many people would put their faces on integrity when it mattered. I wanted to measure whether the family's performance of virtue was a real ethic or just a brand. When they made it a public theater, they assumed their performance would hold. It didn't. The public reaction mattered because my parents' social currency was what encouraged them to treat me like an ATM. Taking that away was part of the point. There were legal conversations that followed. A police report was filed. My evidence made it a matter of interest. The bank's fraud team worked with me to trace transfers. And while the bureaucracy of financial recovery is agonizing, the investigation created an official record that forced my family's hand in ways gossip never could. I'm not a crusader for prosecutions. If someone steals, my first hope is restitution. But if restitution isn't forthcoming, there are other remedies. The police asked questions. Lawyers wrote letters. A mediator was suggested. I was prepared to go to small claims court if I had to. I would have preferred not to, But sometimes the civil system is the only place where private families' boundaries are enforced. There were human consequences, too. Personal ones I hadn't meant to inflict, but that I knew were inevitable. The neighborhood treats my parents differently now. There's distance where there used to be familiarity. Mom's friends stopped inviting her to their knitting group. Dad's volunteer opportunities were shelved because organizations didn't want the attention. Kara's influencer contracts, small local sponsorships, and collaborations fell through after brands reconsidered associations. Seeing them unravel in ways that weren't purely monetary felt like watching a slow erosion of the house of cards they'd built on privilege. I won't pretend there wasn't pain in any of it. I had been angry, yes, but there was also grief. Grief for the family I thought I had, for the image of them as people who would act like decent adults in private as well as in public. There's something horrible about having your parents' failings confirmed in a way that's undeniable. It's a kind of bereavement for the version of them you used to trust. But grief and grief's companion, clarity, are different things. Clarity let me see that my life no longer had to orbit their expectations. Clarity let me build again on my terms. The practical outcome was mixed. The bank froze and then reclaimed a chunk of funds after their audit. Another portion was tied up in accounts that required subpoenas and legal pressure to access. We negotiated mediations. There were moments where I sat in sterile rooms with legal paperwork and felt the weight of what formal justice requires: time, patience, and money. I had more of the first two now than I did the second, but I also had allies, people who had seen the evidence, people who cared about fairness. Slowly, restitution came in various forms, some money, some returned possessions, and in one small but satisfying moment, a public apology from the charity committee that had once praised Mom's integrity. Small vindications, but they were real. The most satisfying victories were quieter. Watching neighbors I respected refuse to host the kind of social validation my parents craved. Watching Kara's friends untag her from posts. Watching Dad's phone stop ringing with the kinds of invites he once lived for. Those things aren't legal outcomes, but they were the cultural consequences my family had used to justify their actions. When those privileges evaporated, they had to grapple with what they'd built their identity on. It was painful for them. And yes, it felt painful for me, too, because I never wanted anyone to suffer more than they needed. But for the first time, suffering had a reason. It was proportional, measured, and human. People asked if I felt guilty. Sometimes, revenge can feel like a hunger you feed and then regret. But I told myself, and still tell myself, that this wasn't revenge in the cliches of movie plots. It was accountability. They'd acted as if family first meant family gets to take what they want. I chose a way of responding that made that phrase impossible to use as a cover. I could have let them off the hook by apologizing, by smoothing things over so no uncomfortable truth ever had to be aired. I refused. I wanted them to understand that boundaries are boundaries, even with those you love. And if love doesn't contain that level of respect, then it's not really love at all. Months later, the fallout has mostly settled into a new normal. The bank returned enough that my accounts were stable again, though the emotional ledger had taken more time to balance. Mom and Dad talk less and argue more, and they've both retreated from public volunteerism for the time being. Kara is quieter, less performative online, more private, and in one small, human sign of change, she began paying me back in incremental sums without fanfare. It was enough to know she understood, finally, that borrowed money is not a blank check for entitlement. I rebuilt in different ways than before. I kept investing, sure, but I also invested in small things that mattered to me. Courses I'd put off, small projects that were mine, nights with friends who had become a chosen family. I slept better. I went to the gym without thinking about how Dad might make a joke about it. I took photos that were mine to keep, not posts to show off. The quiet life I'd always preferred suddenly felt richer because I chose it without carrying a ledger of resentment. A few weeks after the fundraiser, I did something small, symbolic, and a little best of the old and new me. I went to the safe, not because I feared being robbed again, but because I wanted to close a chapter. Inside it were some documents, a few small keepsakes, and a stack of the remaining money that had not been reclaimed. I'd replaced the old combination months earlier, part of the careful housekeeping that had kept my accounts secure. I turned the lock, and when it clicked, The sound felt final but not vindictive. It was the satisfying click of a room door closing behind a phase of life you survived. After everything, I still get messages from people in the neighborhood who tell me, quietly, that they admired the way I handled it. Some tell me they never thought they'd see my parents behave that way. Others say they're relieved someone finally called it out. I don't take compliments the way I used to. They're welcome, but the change that meant the most was the one I felt inside. Less of a need to prove, more of a need to be steady and honest. The house is quieter now. There are still meals we share when we have to, and the small, practical family arrangements remain because life requires them. But the smug little comments that used to land like paper cuts have stopped. Dad's smirk is smaller, and it's softer when it appears. Mom is less performative at bake sales. She quietly helps rather than silently preens. Kara has been the one to change the most visibly. Not perfectly, not all at once. But change is slow, and sometimes it's the kind that arrives as a steady drip rather than a sudden storm. In the quiet after the storm, I did one more small thing that felt good. A tiny, private ritual. I set an alarm for 5:17 a.m. again, not to make phones blow up, but to mark the anniversary of when I stopped pretending that their behavior was acceptable. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and the house still dark, and I wrote a short note to myself. Keep the lines clear. Keep your hands only on the things you earn. Keep your heart guarded but not closed. Then I deleted a contact that had been part of the old choreography. The number I'd used to call family when I wanted something from them that was more about approval than need. I didn't block them. I didn't need the theatrics. I just removed the shortcut. It felt small and strangely kind of final, like burying a small weight. Their phones never did blow up with 61 missed calls. Not because I'd failed, but because I decided humiliation wasn't the end goal. The goal had been to make them notice the boundary, to make the phrase, family always comes first, mean something more than a justification for taking. When I turned off the alarm and watched the sun creep up over the city, I felt lighter than I had in years. The money was no longer the measure of my worth. The choice to stand up had been. I had not wanted their downfall for its own sake. I wanted the dignity I'd quietly built to be respected. And in the end, I got something steadier. A house with clearer walls, a family that had to reckon with itself and myself. Finally, standing in a life that was mine. I closed the safe, and this time the click didn't feel like a threat or an armor. It felt like a door I'd locked not to keep people out forever, but to keep the parts of myself that mattered safe until I decided to open them to someone worthy.